Let me begin today's Opposition Day by stating flat out that our democracy, our electoral democracy, is in serious danger as a consequence of a bill before this House, C-23. The Fair Elections Act, which I think almost everybody who knows anything about this act now is calling the Unfair Elections Act. Conservatives and the Minister of State for Democratic Reform is frankly relying on Canadians' busy lives and complacency about the state of our democracy, his and his government's ability to ram legislation through this House, and he's also hoping for media silence in order to pull off what I would call a kind of Westminster majority government coup. Effectively, that's what we're looking at. Let me also remind everyone of a baseline fact here, that the right to vote is one of the most fundamental rights in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Supreme Court has made clear that statute law needs to be oriented, not only in its enactment, but its interpretation, to enfranchisement, not to the opposite. And the right to vote is not even subject to the notwithstanding clause, where even other important rights like equality rights are. This underlines how very foundational and fundamental the right to vote is in our society. I'm just going to state flat out a couple of overarching premises about this bill before arguing about the elements that we want Conservative MPs in good faith today to vote with us on, to get rid of three elements in this bill that are frankly atrocities. But overall, Bill C-23 is a calculated effort, an intricate tapestry to do two things. One, for ideological or perhaps for some philosophical reasons, to enact a set of principles that are frankly unfair. Perhaps not from the perspective of the minister and his supporters, but standing alone without looking at any partisan advantage, this bill is full of unfairness. But everybody knows, and we'd be blind if we didn't notice, and remiss if we didn't mention, that this is also a bill designed to secure strategic partisan advantage for the party that lies behind this government. The two interact. Now, I have no doubt that a lot of my colleagues in the House have bought certain lines, certain spin from the government, from the minister, trying to keep this in the philosophical realm, trying to ignore how much of an attempt this is to hijack democracy. But I ask them, and I will ask again at the end of my remarks, to please know that Canadians are watching and will notice what they do on this incredibly important bill. The bill engages in and does four major things in clusters. There are tons and tons of points I could draw attention to, but in clusters, this is what the bill does that's so incredibly unfair. First of all, it engages in the result, and now, because that result is so clearly known, by intention, in voter suppression. The primary devices for this are getting rid of the voter identification methods of vouching and the use of the voter information card as authorized by the Chief Electoral Officer. Secondly, it's an active attempt to encourage voter apathy and disengagement, with perhaps the single most important factor there being getting rid of Elections Canada's public education and outreach mandate in an incredibly brutal way. And thirdly, it either does not add the necessary tools to enhance the investigative functions and powers of Elections Canada, in particular the Commissioner for Canada Elections, or it actively undermines the investigative power of Elections Canada, while simultaneously flipping to a focus away from organized fraud of the sort that we were all concerned about and have been for years, that we all thought was going to be tackled in this bill, changing the focus from that to a narrative, a mythical narrative of citizen fraud. And finally, it jacks up big money politics in a big way. I want to come back to the third point, which ties together the questions of voter suppression and lack of a serious tackling of schemes like the automated and live call, robocall scandal from 2011. Effectively, before this bill came down, Canadian society, this House, had trained a telescope on this government. It was demanding a bill that would deal adequately and seriously by giving new investigative powers to Elections Canada to deal with the robocall scheme and anything like it. And instead, that telescope has been turned around. The government is looking back at average Canadians and saying, you are the potential source of fraud. And also, not just you, but the 200,000 election day workers who try to do their job as best they can every election, and yet are now being blamed for a fictional situation of fraud in this country. The NDP has been doing what we can, and I think Canadians would expect no less. Once they become aware of this bill and what it contains, they, almost to a person, are concerned, deeply concerned about it. We would never forgive, they would never forgive us, we'd never forgive ourselves if we weren't taking the fight to the government on this bill in the way we've been doing, because, frankly, as I've said before, some foundational elements of our democracy are at stake. The efforts have been bearing fruit. Civil society stood up to the plate early on and has continued to do so. Too many organizations and individuals have come forward for me to name. And I would say a good number in the print media have as well. Regrettably, not yet the national news broadcasters, but I'm hoping they too will soon see their responsibility to keep this bill in the front of Canadians' consciousness. We had 8 town halls over the course of the last 2 weeks. They were full to bursting. I want to come back to the Globe and Mail as one of the examples of the print media. They did an unprecedented thing by writing 5 editorials in a row condemning this act, taking it apart bit by bit, to the point that I think it was the first one, said, quote, "The Harper government's continued focus on the threat of voter fraud in federal elections is approaching absurdity." The government continued focus on the threat of voter fraud in federal elections is approaching absurdity. And my apologies, Mr. Speaker, for using the name of the Prime Minister. Everyone with any expertise who has examined the question in detail has arrived at the same conclusion: there is no threat. And yet the government insists that controversial provisions in its proposed Fair Elections Act are needed to eliminate this non-existent terror, even at the risk of disenfranchising thousands of legitimate voters. It makes no sense. End of quotation. In another editorial, they say simply, quote, "The Fair Elections Act needs a rewrite and a rethink. It isn't good for Canadian democracy," unquote. And today we see, no doubt, the Globe and Mail being aware that the entire day in the House is now being devoted to our Opposition Day Motion, an editorial entitled, "For the Good of the Country, Kill This Bill." For the government, it's an opportunity to admit error and change course. This bill deserves to die. The Fair Elections Act must be stopped. Killing it should be Parliament's first order of business. Hear, hear. And with that, many of my colleagues will be laying bare the problems with the government's case, the minister's case, which stands on no evidential foundation for getting rid of vouching, getting rid of the use of voter information cards, and gutting public education and outreach. My task as I end is simply to say that I'm speaking to my Conservative colleagues across the aisle. You frankly have been spun by Cabinet and by this minister. You have a duty to look at this in more detail, because if you don't, you will regret it. You must exert your independence, and you must vote with us today on getting rid of these 3 elements. If you don't do the right thing, you will be remembered for not standing up for democracy when it called for it. And if you don't back down, people will remember. I'd end by saying and reminding you that, contrary to what the minister has said in his own editorial today in the Globe and Mail, accusing us and others of hysteria, the fact is more and more Canadians are engaged, more and more Canadians are enraged. You should pay attention. If you don't, 2015 will bring surprise. Thank you.